We're very excited to welcome back one of our star graduates of the CSRH doctoral program, Dr. Denton Callander, who moved on to the Kirby Institute where he is a research fellow, and we still have him as an adjunct research fellow at the Centre for Social Research in Health, which is wonderful. My name's Christy Newman. I work at the Centre for Social Research in Health. And what else do I need to say? We're going to have Denton speak, then we're going to have time for questions and answers, and there's also time to bail him up afterwards because we have got some refreshments here, so please stay if you have time. And I will hand over to Denton. Thank you.
Thanks. Thanks, Christy, and thank you everyone for being here. I'm actually really excited because I get to do something today that I don't often do, which is talk exclusively about methods. So if you were here hoping for some results or data, you can get out right now. No, I have snuck a little bit in there because I couldn't resist, but I think actually it's really important that we pay more attention to methods, and I hope in the future, if you're giving a talk, you will think about, maybe spending a lot more time on your methods, in part because we need new and innovative ways to monitor, observe, study, and understand our social world. It's changing very quickly, and the pace of that change is really whipped into a frenzy in part by our increasingly digital world. So today I'm going to be talking exclusively about the digital methods that I use in collaboration with many people here today to study sex and specifically sex work. But I think these are really relevant to many areas of social inquiry, and in particular the way in which we understand communities and community dynamics. All right, so sex online and studying online phenomena has a number of both challenges and opportunities, and they tend to be the same things depending on how you look at them. So one of the great things from a research perspective about the internet is it tends to archive anything that ever goes on there. So if there's an embarrassing photo of you up there, that's probably not such a great thing, but for a nerd like me, the fact that it pretty much is maintained for all time is great. It also tends to mainly be free. So we're still living in a time where most parts of the internet are accessible without paying any money. That is changing, of course, and we can imagine examples where that is not the case. But for the most part, you can get there without paying anything except for, of course, the cost that it takes to access the internet in the first place. It's also, by extension, mainly public. So I'm talking about the internet as though it's actually one thing. Of course it's not. There are many different parts of the internet, and there are many parts that you will never be able to access, in part because you just don't even know to look for them. And there are other parts that are segregated by membership, by paywalls, so on and so forth. And then of course there's also the dark net, which is a whole other part of the internet. But in and by far, including areas like the darknet, are still mainly public spaces. So most people can access them under most circumstances. But the internet is, as I've said, not just one thing, and it is a host to a range of inconsistent and diverse structures. This is probably one of the main challenges that we face when collecting and trying to interpret online data, that it is just coming from lots of different places that are set up in different ways, and I'll talk a bit more about that later. It also is home to inconsistent and diverse content. So we all know that the internet is largely text, photographs, videos, and then things that tend to be somewhere in the middle, like GIFs and stuff like that. And this is great. It's the way in which we disseminate information, but it's also really challenging to interpret lots of different types of data. And as social scientists, we're pretty good with text, and we're pretty bad with the rest. And I admit that I'm mainly talking about textual data and textual analyses today. In part, we just don't really have, and I'd be happy to be corrected, there aren't really great techniques for analyzing photographic and video data that are widely accessible just yet. So I mean, that's a real challenge that we face. And there's a great paper from a market research firm that was put out a couple years ago that estimated that every minute that goes by, 100 hours of video content is uploaded to YouTube. So I just want you to think about what that means and how much content has been uploaded since I started talking. And that remains pretty much completely unaccessed as a source of research data, and that's too bad. But that's for another time. That's not happening today. And this is really important, we're not talking about something that's happening in a vacuum. There is context and structure that imposes itself upon the way in which people behave online, the types of things that they say and do. And this has particular relevance for something like sex and sex work, both of which face a host of regulations in different contexts. So what is it actually I mean by this? Well, when we go online, we have our own way of being, our own self-regulation that has to do with our needs. It's also about reacting to and reinforcing, establishing, creating social norms. All of that is contained within the things that a service like Grindr does. These are the regulations and controls that are imposed upon users by a service. They tend to vary from site to site, and they're about different types of moderation and control. So to give you an example of what I mean by this, here is a list of words that you simply cannot put into your Grindr profile. I made one of my research associates, Ryan, spend a day trying to figure out what we could and couldn't say on Grindr. You cannot say these. And in case you're not familiar, these are words that have to do with drug use or sex work. So Grindr won't even let you put these in. Here's a list of words that you can sneak by the good old Grindr bots, but they will get your profile banned in a short order. And here, if you're feeling particularly clever, you can get these ones by, and these didn't result in a ban over time, which to me really highlights that this is quite an inconsistent approach, and it's an approach that quite directly targets sex work and drug use. Now, this is a service-level regulation, but I don't really believe for a second that the coke-addled CEO of Grindr has any care about people selling sex or having drugs via his platform. Instead, he's responding to a broader layer of regulation that's imposed by the people who basically run the internet. So if you want to distribute your app through the App Store or through the Google Play Store, you have to adhere to their terms and conditions. And some of those terms and conditions explicitly forbid things like sex work. And if you run afoul of them, they'll just throw you off, and that's it. If you're not selling your app through the App Store, then you don't have a business model. But it's not just app stores, it's our internet service providers. We've seen this, for example, with the just terrible attempts to take down websites like the Pirate Bay. They never really work, but that doesn't stop people from trying. And then, of course, encompassing all of this is the legal regulations that we deal with on a daily basis, and these are reflexively formed with social norms and social regulations. And these all interact and filter down to each other, so it's not just one thing at any one time. And I have to thank Ryan for this beautiful infographic. I did not do it myself. And we see how the legal and social regulation can come to influence online spaces. If you've been paying attention to this news story from the United States over the past couple weeks, again, it's government trying to address a purported problem with sex trafficking by altering laws around what you can and cannot do legally in terms of suing platforms and the content that they house. I can almost guarantee this will have no effect on sex trafficking, but it will have some very unattended and probably, it's hard to actually know what the effects of this kind of change will be. I look forward to writing about it in the future. I just wish they wouldn't do stuff like that. All right, so that's sort of the quick and dirty backstory of these kind of data and these kind of analyses. Today I'm going to be talking about 4 methods in particular, and I want to really focus on what we did and why we did it, but also, the nitty-gritty, how much time it took us, the money it cost, and what value I think this adds to the kind of research that we do. I want to say up front, I think this is really important, these should never be, and are not, our sole method of inquiry. Digital methods, when done just on their own, rarely stand up. They're enriched by connecting with the communities that you hope to study, by engaging with people in offline contexts. I mean, you could, if you wanted to, just lurk around the internet and hope to study communities or groups of people, but I think ultimately you'll be the poorer for it. So the first thing is what I'm referring to as a web audit. This is actually so basic, I'm amazed that I haven't seen it described elsewhere. Maybe someone else has. But it's essentially looking across the internet and just describing what it is you see with respect to a particular concept. So increasingly, as our lives become more digital, we're not talking about communities or practices that exist in one platform or in one digital space. They tend to be quite diffuse and spread across many. And this is particularly true for sex work. So we were curious, okay, where are all the places that male sex work is manifesting online? And so to do this, we did something really simple. We conducted keyword searches using traditional search engines, just to look at the first 3 or 4 pages that Google and Bing would throw up when we typed in sex work or rent boy and etc. We also spoke to sex workers and clients and other stakeholders in this space to gain some insider knowledge about the things that they were doing and the spaces of which they were aware. Then using this growing list of relevant sites, and I should say I'm using website pretty loosely here to refer to basically anything on the internet. This could include an app. Sometimes I call them web services, sometimes I call them web spaces. I don't really like any of those terms. So website's just going to be my shorthand for today. And if you go visit these places and start seeing their connections, then your list continues to grow. You draw upon your own experience as digital citizens. I mean, I spend most of my time on the way to work every day on the internet. You know, I'm always keeping track of that and making notes of it. And then taking all of that information and compiling it into a central database. So this is per website, per app, describing its features and functions, its style, and trying to gauge, based on its content, who the intended audience is. This all seems really simple, but actually it is so useful as a starting place for understanding a community or a network that exists online. And when you have your data organized into this type of very straightforward database, you can start to engage with the more traditional analytical techniques with which we're familiar. So we conducted a thematic analysis of these websites and apps, and we discovered that they tend to exist to serve a particular purpose, or what we perceive to be the purpose. And I know I said no results, but this is important for later as well. So when you're talking about sex work online, essentially the spaces that exist around and relative to sex work are sometimes about the act of sex work itself, so facilitating connections between clients and sex workers, sometimes for offline encounters, sometimes to remain online. There's also sites and spaces that are devoted to advocacy for or against sex work, but they're promoting a particular agenda. Then there are areas that facilitate discussion and conversation, so this might be like a web forum or a comment section on a newspaper article. And then there are websites that are specifically about putting information out there for sex workers, for clients, or about these issues. So for example, the Melbourne Sexual Health website has a whole page devoted to sexual health and sex work. So from this simple exercise already, we're starting to get a better picture of what sex work looks like in an online space. And this could easily be applied to any practice or community in which you are interested. But as soon as I saw this, I was like, all right, that tells me one thing. But how are people accessing these sites, and what is the relative popularity of some to others? And so to complement this, we employed a web traffic analyst service, which essentially compiles website hits for different websites. And we use this to generate a hit counter of what we perceive to be the 10 most influential websites per thematic category. And I'm not going to give away the results of that one, but it gave us a really clear picture about what was the most popular thing people were doing when they were engaging in sex work online, and also relative to the other activities that were ongoing. So this exercise is simple, it's cost-effective, it's highly instructive, and it's very unobtrusive. It really doesn't affect the people that we're studying or the communities in which we're interested. It's a very at arm's length approach. By that same rationale, it's somewhat surface level. So we're only really getting our interpretation of these websites and their meanings, and that has its limitations as well. And I've put that requiring insider knowledge as a con. It's not really a con, but it's really important, because if we weren't engaging with people who understood these communities and who were members of them themselves, there's a lot that would have been missed. What I would also say with respect to the surface level stuff is that since undertaking this exercise, we've started to reach out to the webmasters and the owners of various websites and web spaces to engage them in the research and to interview them, and that has proved to be a really exciting, more traditional cast-off of this digital method. All right, so in terms of time, this whole exercise took us maybe 90 hours in total. So that was me and Ryan, our research associate, compiling, talking to people, conducting the analysis, revising, and so on. In terms of costs, there's virtually no cost. So we paid a web subscription to a website for a couple months, and the web trafficking analysis for 2 months cost us just shy of $400. So this is, if I were a PhD student, this is what I would be doing, because it costs you nothing except for your time, which is arguably the most valuable thing that we have. But anyway, that's something else. All right, so we have this thematic framework, and this is, again, I think only part of the story. And once I saw this, I became really curious. Okay, in this I think what I have to say is probably one of my more beautiful Venn diagrams. This makes it look like it's all neatly connected, but that is, of course, not really the way that these things work. So to understand the relationships between websites and web services, and especially those within different domains, we conducted what I'm referring to as a link analysis. So a link analysis is essentially a bit of code that trawls the internet using seed websites. So you provide the websites to the code works its magic, goes to those websites, and then follows every single hyperlink that exists on those pages, including banner ads and other things. So it does this, it goes to your seed websites, it follows every hyperlink, and then it follows every hyperlink again. So you can imagine what this is doing. It's starting to create a network, starting to assess relationships between different websites. To do this, we established a thematic framework, and then we had to compile the list of websites that we thought would be most relevant. So we had up to 100. We selected 25 within each of those domains. Then we provided that to the team that actually does this analysis. It's a small startup called Uberlink located in Canberra. It's run by an academic at ANU. And it's kind of, this is where I guess we get into some of those black box methods. So I don't actually own the code. This is the Uberlink team's, this is their proprietary information. I don't know how it looks, I don't know how it works, except that I've seen it work with other projects in the past, so that's sort of the extent of my knowledge. And I think it's really important to be clear here about that sort of black box nature. That being said, it would take literally years of work and expertise that I don't have to develop something like this. So in some respects, I absolutely have to rely on the expertise of others. Now, this is work that's ongoing at the moment. We've just put together the link list. It's now with the Uberlink team. They're developing. And eventually what they'll produce a host of things, but they'll produce something like this. This is a network map of websites that are related to basically cryptocurrency and blockchaining technology, just as a demonstrative example. So you can see it reveals quite quickly those that you might consider authorities based on links in and links out. So this is links out at the moment, but it does links in as well. And it starts to reveal relationships. And for each one of these relationships, it also provides a quantifiable indicator. So you can see relative authority, relative connection. So I have a website, for example. I just suggest you all check it out. It's a great place to be. I link to the University of New South Wales website. The University of New South Wales probably has thousands of websites that link to it, whereas I only have maybe 2 other websites that link to it, and they're both owned by me, linked to my website. It's really useful to be able to quantify that kind of difference because it reveals in a space, especially with which you're not very familiar, the relative authorities and nodes. So the pros of this kind of approach is that it quantifies relationships. It can be used to reveal nodes and authorities, and it can intersect with social media. So that analysis that I just showed you doesn't actually link to social media, but it can link into Twitter accounts in particular, although it can't go any further than that. So there's no Facebook capability or anything. Cons, that it's potentially misleading. So just because someone links to your website doesn't mean they actually think it's a good website. Doesn't make you actually an authority. And that's something that requires careful interpretation and, again, interacting with people who actually use and manage these services. It's also best with certain types of websites, what I would call the traditional websites that are very text and link focused. If you're talking about something that's a little bit more complex, like something that uses JavaScript, it's just not going to work. The technology is sort of limited there. And it requires many websites to be meaningful. So if you're talking about a very small, contextualized community, you just won't get the same kind of output. So in total, this has taken us about 65 hours of time so far. I've also guessed it'll take about 15 hours of interpretation and consultation with the Uberlink team. And that costs us $2,200, which is a one-time payment. This is definitely the basement level or the entry level kind of thing that they do, and you can add more complicated analyses. You can have them go further beyond 2 catchments. You can have them repeat the analysis every 6 months if you're looking for changes over time. As I said, you can involve social media. You can get more complicated reports. But for our purposes, this is really the best. All right. How are we doing? Any questions about those 2? I know I'm sort of burning through them quickly, but yes.
I was just curious, in the web audit level, how did you account for the personalized algorithm of the search engines? So like your search results are based on you.
Yeah, that's.
Can you repeat that?
Yeah, so the question was about the inherent bias of search engines that tend to be based on the things that I search. That's a great one. So we had a number of people doing these searches, but also more than that, the searches were really just a starting point for what we found past that. So I would never rely on any of these search engines as your sole source of information, because most of the internet is not indexed by search engines. So you're really only getting very certain types of information, and information that is heavily influenced by commercial gain. So it's really just a starting point.
I was just wondering, with the link analysis, can you also get data on the amount of traffic that comes via those links?
No.
That's a shame.
That is a shame. That's. I wonder if that could be combined with a web traffic analysis. The web crawler just wouldn't be able to sit there and wait for the traffic to happen, and that's basically what it would need to do. But yes, you're right, because having a link is not the same as people actually following that link.
How do you anticipate including a thematic analysis in that data?
In the link analysis?
Yeah.
I don't.
Oh, and it was just in the hours that you recorded.
Right. So maybe I was counting the thematic analysis from the web audit, which informed the link analysis. So without the thematic analysis, you'd have no. I mean, you could still do it, but that's really the basis or the impetus for that kind of research. All right. So we have this growing understanding of the web space that is relevant to sex work today in Australia and around the world. And what's really clear is that there are a number of places where sex work itself is taking place. So across a host of different platforms, truly, if you can imagine it, it's probably happening in one way or another. And I think that's great. There's lots of different ways to connect with clients and vice versa, and it's lots of different opportunities which we need, especially now that the government, yes, it's very hot in here, which I like, and it sort of keeps me invigorated. But. So we were curious then, can we capitalize on the availability of digital communication to better understand the types of negotiations that clients and sex workers have, the way in which essentially they get the things that they want out of commercial sex encounters? And this is one of the main questions that this project is curious about. So to do this, we've developed a program of what I'm calling, it sounds awful actually, I really need to work on my naming for all of these, but communication scraping. I mean, scraping is actually the technical term for taking digital data. I don't know who came up with that. It's not very nice at all, and maybe I'll work on this over time. But essentially what I'm talking about here is working with sex workers to extract and de-identify their communication relevant to sex work. So looking across all the different platforms that they use, and extracting that information in a way that is secure and that is safe and that is highly instructive about the types of relationships that sex workers and clients form. So what did we do? As I've already discussed, we've been identifying channels of communication, and they are many. Then we work with participants. So these are people who are already engaged in this project in some sort of offline context, with whom we've had several encounters, who are familiar with the research, with whom we have developed rapport and trust. We work with them to identify the platforms that they use to communicate with their clients. These are sex work participants, I should say. And then we basically sit down with them and extract their different modes of communication. And this is contextualized either by a time period, so we might seek to obtain all the communication over the past 2 days, or a relationship. So we might seek to extract all the communication from, say, one of their longest running clients, or look at communication that didn't end in a commercial sex encounter, trying to inject some variety into the different ways in which people connect and whether or not that results in a commercial sex encounter or not. Then with the sex workers, with our participants there, we de-identify the communication. So we don't take it and de-identify it later, we de-identify it with them right in front of them. This is very, probably for both people, annoying and time consuming, but it is essential. Think for a second what it is we're actually doing. Imagine someone comes to you and says, I want all your text messages for the past 2 days. Like, oh God, I'm feeling not good about that right now. So it's really, really important that we recognize how sensitive an operation this is, and that it's not just something that you can be doing willy-nilly. So by engaging in de-identification on site, you're ensuring that nothing that is potentially sensitive or identifying is actually ever removed. And that's the only way I can ever see something like this working. Following that, with each bit of communication, you have a conversation with the participant. You have them describe what was going on, who this person is, what the relationship is. Really important for contextualizing and describing what's going on. All of that, the de-identified communication as well as the contextual details, then become part of a central database. This is work that's ongoing right now. This is something that we're just kind of learning on the go as we're going, and I think it's going to be really exciting to see what these data look like and what sort of analyses we can conduct with them as a way to understand concepts like agency, negotiation, trust, as well as just the very tangible strategies that people use to get what they want out of a sex encounter, because that's really what this is ultimately about. All right, so the pros of this kind of approach is that it's highly detailed. It allows us to explore relationships in a very personal way. And so much of communication with regards to sex work, but sex generally, sometimes right up until the moment when you open the door is textual. It's all contained within the digital world. So I think it's really important that we be seeking to understand and capture these relationships if we can. As an extension of that, it reveals a lot about how people communicate their sexual wants and needs. The cons, it's highly sensitive. This is probably the most sensitive thing that this project is doing, and so it requires a degree of attention and care. It requires constant negotiation with the communities and participants. It really does, it's not something to be taken lightly because it requires, in part, considerable trust. And it is actually very time consuming to sit down with someone and try. You can't just say, hey Siri, give Denton all of my sex work and related communique over the past 5 days. Every platform requires a different strategy for extracting it. It's, it's screenshotting, it's copying and pasting, it's tedious. And if someone's operating across 6 or 7 different platforms, I mean, it just really does take time. So we estimate that it takes about 7 hours per participant, and we're aiming to do this for about 10 people, so that will be a total of 70 hours. I think that's actually low. It'll probably be more like 10 hours per participant when all is said and done. That includes the time that it takes to talk about what's going on and what's happening. Cash money. So participants are reimbursed $100 per day of communication that they provide, or $100 per relationship that they provide, depending on how it's organized, up to a maximum of $500 per participant. This is over the course of the project, so it's not just all happening in one sitting. So across 10 participants, that could cost up to $5,000. All right, last but not least, profile database. Another really scintillating and wonderful name. So profiles that relate to sex and sex work, but sex generally, have been really useful sources of information for a long time. And I use them actually as part of my PhD to study how gay men were talking about race through their manhunt profile. And they can be used, if done properly, I think they can be really instructive and informative as one source of data. They should never be the sole source of data, as I've said a few times. And I say that in part because they're maybe the easiest source of data to get on when it comes to sex and sexuality. So I think people go there first quite a bit. And I review heaps of papers that use profile data, but I think there needs to be a little bit more. But they can be really useful. The great challenge with them is that it's really time consuming to collect the data. So you either have to manually copy and paste every profile, and having copied and pasted 900 manhunt profiles, something I do not want to do again. Or you have to employ a coding expert who generates code to extract the data that you want, which you have to do for every website. That's, again, very time-consuming and expensive. That's why a couple of years ago I was really excited when I saw a presentation at some conference in the US about this software called Import.io, which essentially can be tailored to each individual website to extract the data per your specifications. Now, profile websites, each one tends to be a little bit different, but within each website, the profiles tend to follow a stock standard format that's the same regardless of the profile. So to give you an example of what I'm talking about, this is your very standard sex work profile, generic as they come. It includes information about, their height, their weight, services offered, prices, so on and so forth. This is pretty much exactly the same format as you see on any social media sex and dating website, but this one's specific to sex work. It also includes what I call a giant Rorschach test, which is basically where people are told to write something about themselves, and that is really where things get interesting. It's free text. It's a great opportunity for self-expression, and it's where a lot of signaling and subtext around sex takes place. And we've seen this for decades with respect to HIV status. We see it quite commonly now, not obviously on a website devoted to sex work, but in other websites you see sex work signaling, you see drug use signaling. People are signaling about all the things that they don't want to say outright. And they sort of work together to create a whole picture here. If you can turn that into this, which is what has been done with the Import.io software, I'm like getting a little bit giddy just thinking about it now. And this is what we are working on now. It's still underway, but essentially, and you can't see it, but this goes over and it's taken every one of these categories and put it into a neat, coherent spreadsheet. I mean, wow, that's the best thing I can possibly imagine. And it happens literally with the push of a button. Now, it can be tailored to be done in a way that is not just about grabbing as much data as you can. And yes, I will freely confess that I'm a greedy data pig, but it also can be done in a way that makes sure that you are protecting and respecting the online identities and presence of the people who maintain these kinds of profiles, because I think that's pretty important as well. And that can be done really easily. You don't have to collect a username. You're not collecting images, and so on and so forth. So just to go over really quickly this process, we looked for websites with a large number of sex work profiles. We did sort of some more of the web audit stuff. We configured the software to extract the data. Now this was by far the longest process. It took a lot of time to figure out how to do this, and that's something I should be upfront about. It's not something that really just happens straight out of the box. And it involves lots of testing and reconfiguring to your needs, generating a data dictionary, quality assurance. So we've just, again, this is really still in its pilot phase. But from the profiles we have extracted, when we compared them to their online versions, they were accurate 100% of the time, which is really nice. Then, of course, there's data cleaning and organization, and there's the establishment of a protocol for data extraction and management. So why would we want to collect data like this? It might be for qualitative analyses, it might be for quantitative analyses, or some combination of the both. I mean, even being able just to describe the characteristics of a sex work market is really useful, and it's not something that can be easily done through other sources of data. But also, returning to that idea of sexual signaling, you can get some idea of how, and this is true, again, across dating profiles, but this one is specific to sex work. You can look at, okay, what proportion of profiles are talking about HIV status, STI status, their PrEP use, their drug use, and so on and so forth. And these are things that we can pull out of the free text About Me section. And this is actually not from the profile database, but it's from an analysis that was that manually extracted these kind of data, both last year and then again this year. And because of the ease with which we can extract these data, it is our intention, once it's all up and running, to run an extraction on the first day of every month for a period of 5 years. Oh God, that makes me so excited, because I want you just to pay attention to this. This is one concept. It's a small one. I mean, obviously it's not a small one, it's a big one, but it's an example of a change that can be readily quantified through textual data. And if you can monitor this closely over long and short periods of time, including in places where PrEP hasn't been introduced, you can literally see how language and practice changes in response to an intervention like this. And this is only one type of thing that you might be curious about doing. There are many. But this isn't possible through our traditional styles of qualitative analysis that involve deep immersion in text. We extract, across a number of websites, we aim to extract maybe 12,000 profiles every month. Now, many of these will be repeated over time, but there's just no way you can analyze that level of text. So to do this, we're working now on generating a code that essentially undertakes computational parsing. So you always, at least at this stage, will have to do the qualitative analysis in depth and deep. But once you have established a framework for your qualitative understanding of these data, which we have done in some respects around safer sex and sexual signaling, then all you need to do is write code that can recognize key phrases, key words, and can be applied to each extraction over time to majorly simplify this task. And it's never, I talk a lot about automated processes in my work of data extraction. That's a lie that I often tell my audiences. Nothing is ever automated, but it can be easily maintained through just very simple review of your code and your extracts over time. All right, So pros, this is a longitudinal, ecological, and sort of automated process. I have never seen this kind of longitudinal, qualitative, quantitative data for this area of study, and I think it will open up a lot of possibilities. And I want to, use it for lots of different questions, including those that we haven't talked about today. The cons is you're interpreting secondary data. These profiles are not created for nerds like me to be, just deeply analyzing what it is I thought people meant or what they wanted. That always must be kept at the forefront of our minds when we're interpreting these kind of data. And websites change over time. We've seen this rather spectacularly with a few sex work websites lately. Some crash, new ones arise. Every time that happens, it will require retooling of the software. And as you can see, the retooling took maybe 50 hours in total. It was quite a bit of time. So we estimate it was almost 200 hours to get it set up. And every year, including the maintenance of the computational parsing and the extraction of the data, will take about 36 hours. The software costs about $67 a month. So I think we've paid for I think we're looking at a 5 or 6 year subscription, which includes a 90% discount for researchers. All right. Holy man. I'm sorry, I know that was a lot. This is basically a summary of the things that we've done. But what I don't want to forget about, and I'm aware that I'm running out of time here, but we really need to talk about this, if not just briefly, which is the ethics and optics of this kind of research. I wasn't ignoring it. In fact, I wish I had time to devote exclusively to this topic, because so many of these things would make many people very nervous. And we're living at a time when the use of digital data is getting a lot of attention in the media. So this is great. It's good. It's forcing a conversation. And this conversation is important because every single time I go to an ethics committee with a project like one of these, they absolutely lose their minds. They just go bonkers. They don't even know what's going on. And in some respects, although that makes me a little bit annoyed, you can't blame them, because we have no consistent policy at this university or at other universities of which I'm aware that addresses this kind of research. So we fall back to our traditional platforms, and that doesn't make sense. All right, so really quickly, what are the ethical issues here? You're creating an archive of digital content. Digital content is naturally archived, but if you change, let's say, your profile content, there's probably no record of that saved for a long period of time. I am now intending to create a record of that will be housed outside of the website. That has implications, particularly as we think about potentially illegal and stigmatized activity. By virtue, you're collecting potentially sensitive information. I think that's really important. And to ask yourself, how am I respecting and protecting the online identities of these people? I mean, we know that damage to someone's online identity can have almost the same type of impact as damage to their offline identity. These two things are not separated anymore. Again, you're using content that's created for another purpose, so that has relevance to our analysis and interpretation. But again, sometimes I ask myself, how comfortable would I be if I knew someone were reading my Facebook posts and using them in research? Now, I personally am not bothered by that. And I have to say, if you don't think that every single thing you post on the internet is being used by another person, then you're lying to yourself. But that's not really, while that is true, we need to be better than the people who are in the news today because they abuse online data in the ways that they have. The challenge is, of course, you're rarely in a position to gain individual level consent. I think we can all see that just simply would not be possible. But consent can be negotiated through other ways. So negotiating things with webmasters, talking, as I've said, to the communities, engaging them in the research process so people are aware of what you're doing and none of it is a surprise when you present these findings at a conference. Another thing is that terms and conditions apply even if you're not a member of a website. So every website will have established regulations around what you can do with their content, and you are bound by those, as the university lawyers have been telling me these past couple weeks. So you must negotiate this very carefully, and yeah, I'm working on that one now. And then, as I said, the public perceptions around the use of online data. So, thank goodness for Cambridge Analytica for putting this one in the headlines. And what's really troubling, this story I found particularly troubling because it's about not the abuse of those data to potentially influence an election or a referendum. It's about Facebook providing data for academic purposes that resulted actually in the publishing of this peer-reviewed paper. You can see this is one of the main architects of the whole shebang, and Facebook is even listed as a co-author, some people from Facebook. So the conflation of these two things will cause people to be more distrustful. And just yesterday, Grindr, letting all the HIV data out. I mean, there's lots going on in this space. We want to be better, and we want to establish norms that separate our intentions, which I do think are more honorable than the intentions of some other people. But I think there are always some things to remember here. Data are publicly available. These are public spaces. And again, it's partly about educating people about the way in which online data are used, the way in which they are available. It is possible for us to adhere to the same tenets of de-identification that we do with all of our other sorts of data. We can employ security and management protocols. These are all things that we're doing with this project. And we can and must engage with the people that we are studying as opposed to just lurking around them on the internet. So really quickly, I just want to thank a number of people. The Australian Research Council funds this project. Basil and Victor, who are CIs and my mentors, who are always encouraging me to follow these leads. Cameron and Jules at Scarlet Alliance and SWAP, with whom we have coordinated quite a bit on this project. Project advisory members, Garrett, Paco, and Stephen. Rob Acklin from Uberlink and Ryan McNally from Import.io. Taylor and James, two of our RAs, and Ryan DeVoe, who has been the chief RA on this project and has been really, really willing to experiment with me. Thanks.
Thank you, and we have just over 10 minutes for questions. Okay, and if you could speak into this, that'd be great.
What is PrEP use? How do they use it?
What was that?
PrEP use, P-R-E-P.
PrEP, yeah. So PrEP is a medication that can prevent HIV. And we're curious, so we know there's been huge uptake of it among communities of gay men, but we really know almost nothing about how sex working communities are making use of it, and that's what's driving our interest there.
Thanks.
I'm sorry, I just have to say I'm delighted that there's someone who's never heard of PrEP before. This is, obviously we're reaching some new audiences. That's all right, it's just it's a hot topic of conversation among our circle of researchers for sure. Philip, do you
yeah, thanks, Denton. That was really interesting. I guess it was interesting also that you pointed to the need to carefully consider ethical issues. And when you were talking about the work that you were doing with sex workers around documenting their interactions with clients, I wondered how the ethics committee got their heads around the consent of clients, because obviously the sex workers were able to consent to handing over the transcripts of their encounters, their communication, but the clients presumably didn't.
Yeah, no, that's a great question, and it's something that comes up a lot about gathering data on other people based on, people who have consented, and really they actually were surprisingly unbothered by that as a whole, except to ensure that we were de-identifying obviously any parties involved with the communication. But yeah, that was one surprisingly didn't raise their flags as much as I thought it would.
On that point of de-identifying the communication between the sex workers and clients, how deeply did the ethics committee go into the processes there? I'm particularly thinking about things like timestamp data, which can be used as a fingerprint with no other information.
Yeah, no, that's a good one. So we submitted a protocol for exactly what would be done with each kind of data that we expected to interpret, and I'm glad you raised time, or expected to encounter. We don't have time, it's all just based around date. Again, there's the potential risks around that, I suppose, but truly it is the most de-identified data you could encounter. So it's not even linked to the aliases of our participants, it just exists as a date, and here was the communication with everything completely scratched out.
Just in regards to Import.io, is there any restrictions around gathering data from, say, mobile applications? Is it just all web-based, or does it have other potential?
Yeah, I think it's exclusively web-based at the moment. It's in part because of that diverse structure thing I was talking about. Every app is basically set up a little bit differently. Accessing their content just doesn't really work in quite the same way. I could be wrong about that, though. We've only explored it for web thus far.
Are you looking at developing code that might potentially in the future extract that information, or are you just looking purely at web-based for profile?
Yeah, well, one of the nice things about Apple and Google hating sex work is that we don't have to worry about the app space as much. It's all happening. So, obviously for other sex seeking, it's predominantly apps these days, I would suspect. But the thing about apps that's always been a bit annoying is that they're really small, so you don't actually get a lot of information. You know, I showed you that profile. There's like a whole little paragraph, several paragraphs there. That's rich. That's lots of data. Whereas Grindr is maybe a sentence or a sentence fragment, and I've never been sure just how useful that is. Although I've been really curious if there was some way we could measure prevalence of sex work on Grindr, but given their lockdown on any kind of public signaling, it's proved difficult.
Hi. I guess I wanted to first speak to Philip's point. There's no advocacy groups for clients, so nobody's advocating on their behalf, and there's no great benefit to identifying as a client. There is a fiscal benefit to identifying as a sex worker. So I think that just a sex workers group's lack of interest in protecting the identity of clients might not be a good reason to not think about that a little bit more. And then just in general about SESTA and FOSTA. So the two American pieces of legislation, I'm currently watching online sex workers scrubbing their digital identities and making them into dating profiles. So I guess I wanted you to talk about the vulnerability of your research to massive changes in legislation, even in another country.
Yeah, that's a great point, but actually I think it's not necessarily a vulnerability so much as our research, because it's already here and in place and happening now, will really nicely be able to, not nicely, but will capture this important moment and be able to document the changes that take place. So maybe it's a drop in sex worker profiles. We're already talking to men about their experiences. And I'm not sure if you guys are familiar with what's going on, but essentially there's great fear that traditional avenues through which sex workers have advertised, have communicated with each other, have shared information, they might face persecution for doing those kinds of things. So they're taking a step back now while they can to prevent some blowback later. And so yeah, you're right. It does raise new challenges, but the thing about the internet is like you can never really, it's like energy, you can't destroy a practice, right? It just sort of morphs into something else. And I feel confident that this project has, in addition to the digital methods, the other methods as well, the capacity to understand, to capture, and to describe that change.
Things like Craigslist personals going down.
Yeah.
There's a massive wiped out data source right there.
Yeah, which is too bad because the focus on profiles it's a bit tricky because actually it's really focusing on one type of sex work, and we know that more casual contextual sex work often happens in these other spaces like Grindr, like Backpage, like Craigslist. And so we risk reproducing certain expectations or certain stereotypes about sex work when we fail to account for its diverse manifestations.
Thanks. I was just wondering, did you access the dark web at any time during your research? And do you have any estimate of how much, what proportion of these activities are going on there?
That's a great question. No, I haven't. And I mean, if sex is crazy and fun on the regular internet, I imagine it is truly, truly alarming and interesting in the dark web, but I don't know. And I actually have no idea about sex work on the dark web. Do you have any? It's partly just because I'm not actually very technologically savvy. I'm not even sure I know. You have to get like a special thing and hook it up. That's all I know. But yeah, I do think that warrants some consideration. And as I mentioned at the start, it's a bit silly of me to talk about the internet as though it's only one thing. It's in fact many different things, and I guess we're only getting one piece of it at the moment.
Given the ability of, I can't even think of the word, people to make, it's a great word, given the ability of people to make profit out of online spaces and data from online spaces, the material that you're going to generate through your analysis, have you thought through about the potential ways in which that might be turned, not by yourself, but turned to commercial profit or commercial gain by people who run the sites from which you are scraping?
God, I wish I could turn into some commercial gain for myself. Hadn't really thought about that. The main place where that becomes an issue is when you go to a website and you say, I'm not going to bother you, I'm not going to do anything, but I am going to take all of your data and I'm going to use it for these purposes. That's when people start to get a little bit fussy, and that's what I'm dealing with at the moment. So to avoid violating terms and conditions, I sometimes have to engage directly with webmasters. And anytime you say to someone, I want your data, I mean, even if they have no intention or no idea about how to make use of it for their own purposes, they start to get a little bit funny. And this is something we encounter all the time when we try to extract data, say, from private laboratories in Australia for other purposes other than this project. So it's just, I guess it's trying to create relationships that transcend commercial interests, but sometimes that's just not possible because most people are online to get laid or to make money, I guess.
You can feed the data back to sex workers so we can identify a time waster quicker.
That's right.
Anybody else? Or we can wrap up. Well, I would like you to join me in thanking Denton for a very interesting presentation.